Mistakes are common, or so you think. Some of the show's mistakes are too outrageous, you won't even believe they made their way past the editing crew. Welcome to Riveted, where we cover all things Stranger Things. The mistakes go way back, and we'll start from the beginning.
Season 1, Episode 3.
When Nancy wakes up at Steve's house, there's light outside, but when she goes out, it's nighttime. Huh? How did they not differentiate night and day? We literally say that things are as opposite as night and day. Still on the same episode, Hopper has a modern Motorola Walkie Talkie which came into existence at least 10 years later. It was either a Motorola HT1000 or an MT2000 series. Both came out around the late 90s. They should have used a model like MT1000 for the show, and it would have made sense. We may assume that they didn't find the model, but using a model from 10 years later is off. Episode 5. The bus that appears in the scene is a Bluebird TC2000 dating from 1998 to 2003, long after the setting of the series. And it wasn't just the bus in that episode. Almost all buses on the show were made years later. Let's assume it was a bit expensive to get many buses from the 80s. Of course, the editors tried to have as few mistakes as possible in the second season, but some pretty dumb ones were still very evident. Season 2, Episode 1. During the police pursuit in Pittsburgh, the officers are wearing shoulder, speaker, microphone handsets. The models are the Motorola Sabre radio, which weren't introduced until 1989. Well, at least they were not as off as the one Hopper used in Season 1. Episode 8. Hopper has an M16A4 with tactical short shoulder butt, which was not around in the 80s. With just a bit more research, this is a mistake which could have been avoided.
In the same episode, Joyce tries to get Will to come down and the only way she could do that was to remind him of something memorable.
Joyce asks Will to remember when he was 8, and she bought him a giant box of crayons. On the show, she's referring to a box with 120 crayons, yet around the time when they were shooting the show, there were only 78 colors available. Chicago Skyline. Season 2 scanned the downtown Chicago skyline, and residents noticed a few things which were off. The Blue Cross Blue Shield Tower, opened for business in 1997, was in view. The Prudential Plaza, which was finished in 1990, was also visible, and the Trump Tower, which is only a decade old, could also be seen. It was probably impossible to find quality footage of Chicago in the 80s, but I'm sure the show would have done fine without the skyline. I mean, Trump's Tower? Really? There's no way that one could have gone unnoticed. Jeez. The Dig Dug Game. The video games are a big part of the show. We give them a thumbs up for getting many of the games correct in this internet era. Among the games is the famous Dig Dug game. The show got the year right because it was introduced in 1983. But there's something else they didn't notice. In the 1980s, the high scores board only allowed 3 characters like Mad, Deuce, and Luke. On the show, we had Mad Max, Dustin, Lucas, and so forth. Well, in the second edition, the high score board could have up to 6 characters, which is the most logical explanation as to why the players' names have 6 characters, but it was introduced in America in 1989, a few years after the scene. For whatever reason, shows tend to make more mistakes in subsequent seasons. It's either viewers become keener or the editing team stops caring. Season 3, Episode 1. Thanks to 11, Dustin's collection of toys comes to life. If you look very closely, you will notice one of the robots is the Transformer Ultra Magnus. Yes, it seems modified, but the problem is that the season was set in July 1985, and the Transformer Ultra Magnus was launched in the US in 1986. A similar version existed in Japan, and it's possible to imagine that Dustin painted his toy. The question would be, how did he know the exact color of the US version without seeing it? The animated movie was released in 1986, so there was no way he would have painted it in 1985. In the same episode, Bruce has a hamburger with bacon on top and salad at the bottom. In the next shot, the salad is on top and the bacon has disappeared. There's ketchup instead. Wow, I guess he was too hungry on set and they ran out of bacon and hoped he wouldn't notice? Episode 5. This episode probably has the most mistakes ever in an episode. Steve Harrington knocks down one of the soldiers and Dustin congratulates him. There's also a silhouette of someone, probably one of the crew members, and he appears to be hiding.
As Jonathan and Nancy run and hide in the OR, after Nancy picks up the red phone, the reflection of the upside-down reflection briefly shows a man in shorts and sneakers. Later on, Jonathan jabs scissors into Tom's throat. When Jonathan leans back out of breath, the upside-down reflection also shows a cameraman's arm and the camera moving. Still on Episode 5, Mike gives 11 some M&Ms while they are waiting in the hospital, and among the tasty treats from the colorful assortment is a red one. Season 3 took place in 1985 when red M&Ms didn't exist. The red treats were restored in 1987, so unless Mike had stored some from 1976, it was impossible to have them in 1985. The only other logical explanation is that the hospital stocked enough M&Ms to last them a decade, which is highly unlikely considering the red ones were deemed cancerous. Netflix may change the color to orange for future viewing, but at the moment, it's still a mistake. Episode 6.
The Russian asks for a cherry flavor, and he refuses to talk, so he gets thrown out. The French energy company Total is very evident at the back, even though it came into existence in the 2000s. Seriously? Episode 8. The value of Planck's constant used in the show is 6.62607,004. And that value was updated in 2014. The value that was used in 1985 was 6.626176. I know it's probably not a very big deal, but for physicists, all decimal points count. A bit of research would have avoided that simple mistake and a backlash from the nerd community. Okay, mistakes can be made, some are unavoidable, but repeating errors is something else. Like Barb's car. On the show, Nancy Wheeler's best friend Barb drives a Volkswagen Cabrio. There is no way it existed in 1983 because they were made in 1988. Then we have the fancy Walkie Talkies. The boys needed the Walkie Talkies to communicate, and we appreciate the use of technology, but the show should have given them something less fancy. Take Will, for instance. He owned one, yet his single parent was already struggling to raise him. The TRC 214 Walkie Talkies used in the show were only used by professionals back in the day, and there's a high likelihood that they weren't in existence in 1983. During the conversations, the kids are also seen interrupting the other person on a two-way radio. It's not how the radios of that era worked. If one person transmitted and then one interrupted, there would be no communication. The bikes. The bikes in the show are evidently an important aspect, and it was difficult to get a bunch of them from the 80s, but there's something about them which didn't pass our eyes. At night, the bikes all emit white light, but during the day, they are orange. It's common to use gel while shooting to balance the light, but why didn't they remove the gel while shooting the daytime scenes? We can even see the tape in some of the bikes. Yikes! Ironically, it would have been easier to manipulate the current light system to get an accurate representation of the 80s lighting system. Also in the 1980s, the kids' bikes must have been powered by tire-driven dynamos, meaning the light levels should vary according to the speed, which never happened on the show. Use of a modern slang. I know it must have been very tempting for the kids not to use modern slang because they were born in the modern era. They tried, but there's one which slipped out a couple of times. Chill. Okay, people in the 80s used the word chill, but they didn't mean to hang out like in Stranger Things.
Ooh, I just got the chills.
The Demogorgon figurine. Of all the things which could possibly go wrong on Stranger Things, I can't believe they got the Demogorgon figurine wrong.
The figurine they use on the show wasn't introduced until 1986. The U.S. flag. U.S. flag patches worn by the police officers are incorrect. On the patches, the Field of Stars has too many stripes to the right of it and not enough stripes underneath. On the actual flag, the field sits on the fourth white stripe from the top. On the patches, it sits on the red stripe below it, the fifth red stripe. Producers believe that it's illegal to impersonate the uniform, but in the real sense, the companies get permission to copy the uniforms accurately. It's only that some of them never bother to do the research. Choice of songs. A Hazy Shade of Winter by the Bangles plays in the intro as Steve and Nancy are making out. While the original version was released in 1968, the version played on the show was released 3 years after the kiss takes place. Corey Hart's song, Sunglasses at Night, plays on Steve's car radio as he drives to Nancy's house. The song wasn't released until the following year. Many productions use songs by Tangerine Dream as soundtracks, and the Duffer Brothers were not an exception. The problem is the song they used while Hopper ripped his trailer apart to try and find a bug didn't exist for another 3 years. Well, the song was recorded in 1973, but it was released to the public over 10 years later. Then we have other simple mistakes which clearly prove that someone was sleeping on the job. The maple syrup bottles did not have flip-top caps in the 1980s, but on the show, the flip-top caps are present. The police light bar on Chief Hopper's 1980 Blazer is a Code 3 MX7000, manufactured by Public Safety Equipment, which was not sold until the mid-1990s. In many instances, the bad guys used Crossman 2240 air guns, which were not in existence until the 1990s. Well, we can't say that the show has done a lousy job, but we hope that Season 4, which will probably be the last, will have fewer errors. We hope the Duffer Brothers will not pull a Game of Thrones on us. This has been Riveted, and we publish amazing videos daily. Stay tuned.